Okay. Right. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. Let all of our attendees into the room right now. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator here. And tonight we're very proud to be hosting Paul Goldberger and the launch of his beautiful photo book about Dumbo. Powerhouse Arena is a bookstore that is located in the Dumbo neighborhood in Brooklyn, and it's where I am right now. If you look in the book, I'm here, and I'll share a link later in the chat here to buy a signed copy of the book. All copies bought through Powerhouse will have a signed book plate. Paul will be in conversation with Jack Beyer. If you have any questions, you can use the chat or Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and they'll take your questions at the end of the event. And I'll introduce our speakers now. Jack Beyer is the co-founder of the architecture firm Beyer Blinder Bell. The firm's major projects include restorations of Grand Central Terminal, the TWA Flight Center, Rockefeller Center, the Enid Haupt Conservatory at the New York Botanical Garden, and Ellis Island. Jack's clients include the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the South Street Seaport Museum, Metro North Railroad, Two Trees Management Company, which owns this building, and Harvard and Columbia Universities, among many others. Paul Goldberger, whom the Huffington Post called the leading figure in architecture criticism, is now a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. From 1997 to 2011, he served as the architecture critic for The New Yorker, where he wrote the magazine's celebrated Skyline column. He holds the Joseph Urban Chair in Design and Architecture at the New School in New York City, and was formerly the dean at Parsons School of Design. He began his career at the New York Times, where in 1984, his architecture criticism was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Criticism, the highest award in journalism. And I'll hand it over now.
So are we ready?
Yes, here we are. Let's go.
Okay, so
Okay.
Paul, let me just start by saying how impressed I am and sort of in many ways dazzled by your wonderful book. I think that in many ways it speaks to what is a very, very incredibly dazzling community. And I think you captured it in many, many ways. Certainly the unique family that put it together, the Willentises, who lived there, worked there, played there most of the time. I mean, they did run off once in a while to their horse farm and their beach house in the Hamptons, but they lived for Dumbo. But what struck me also, because I was so involved with the project, was your research, your dedication to getting all the facts straight, all the issues, which are incredibly complicated in this project. And I think lastly, the sensitivity to the incredible love for each other that David and Jane had, and the love that they brought to Dumbo was the thing that really and essentially made Dumbo. So I'm thrilled with your book and hope that it sells very well tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Ongoing days.
Thank you. Well, we all hope, but thank you. Well, that means a lot coming from you, since you were present almost at the creation. You were working with David Willentis on his projects in Manhattan before he crossed the bridge and Dumbo began, and then on a lot of stuff in Dumbo as well. You know, I think you touched on it, because this is the story of a place, but it's also the story of people. And Dumbo could not have evolved as it did without extraordinary people with a unique sensibility. And it really is David Willentis's vision and ability to see what Dumbo could become, his extraordinary patience, because it took decades for it to happen, and Jane's own sensibility which played just such a huge role in it, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of marketing, all that stuff. And the two of them really, were an extraordinary couple who reinforced each other so completely. And so, it's sort of, it's as far from a kind of corporate real estate story as one could imagine. I think maybe that's what attracted me to it, really, is that, what made Dumbo what it is first, you're starting with a unique piece of land in between the two bridges with amazing old buildings and the river view and the bridges themselves. And then you're starting with unique people who are not corporate real estate types. David was always, as because you worked with him, always an iconoclast, always a bit of an outlier in the New York real estate world, which made him so much more interesting than most of the people who were not outliers, actually. And then, the insane political ups and downs that they went through, when you realize that it was getting close to what it was 40 years ago that David more than 40 years ago that he first discovered Dumbo, and 40 years ago since he completed the acquisition of the first bunch of old buildings there that the whole thing started with. So there were several times along the way when it looked like it was all going to fall apart, and it somehow didn't. So now, of course, as you also know, Dumbo's problem is not failure, but too much success. I mean, it's now, the streets are crowded, it's full of tourists. It's sort of like the High Line. The problem is it's not that no one wants to go there. The problem is everyone wants to go there. But we should all have such problems, right? I mean, as urban neighborhoods go, it's a pretty nice problem to have.
Well, you're hitting on so many key points about the people, and I go back with David. I guess he certainly was one of our first clients, along with Jane Jacobs. Why the two of them found us to be of interest, I'm not so sure. But Jane loved. She was doing a plan for the West Village waterfront. Right. You probably know about that. And
yes.
Somehow she was impressed with our presentation and selected us because she thought we knew about community planning.
Right.
And she knew we were involved with restoration. And David found us for reasons that were not so different. He knew that we knew how to rehabilitate old buildings, and there weren't many architects.
You were one of the first firms that did that, right? I mean, now everybody claims they know how to do that, but they didn't back then. I mean, I remember you guys were among the very, very first, and James Marston Fitch joined your firm and helped bring it in that direction, as I recall, right?
No, you're right. And it was something that we certainly didn't learn in college, and it wasn't certainly the main track for many of our peers when they opened their offices and worked with people. They were winning awards for building houses in the countryside or doing beautiful buildings in the city. We were on the subway, going to the Bronx and Harlem to really make old thought tenements function as good housing for low-income families. And I tell you, that's the proudest thing we have ever done, including Grand Central Station, in terms of its long-term social meaning as part of our city being renewed again for new uses and new activities and new humanity. So David saw that, and we were working together ever since on dozens and dozens of projects.
What was your first one? Do you remember?
With David? Yeah. We did an old tenement rehab under
Mhm.
Section 8, which was a Lyndon Johnson program that's long gone, for redoing these tenements. And it meant a very big change, introducing elevators, reducing the square footage to get light and air in the rear of these buildings. And then it went on to Kew Garden Hills, which was a similar thing, but low rise. Our first sort of significant rehab that involved a major building was Alwyn Court. And then it went on to the Silk Building and other buildings, and we did their house, the first rehab of Ward Bennett's beach house. You may
Right,
know
I
that
remember
the
David
second
told me about
rehab.
that. Yes, yes,
Uh,
yes.
So we did so many things with David and Jane. We became very good friends, and as we are always thinking alike.
Yes. And I mean, you too, like me, must have been attracted by David's passion and the way he was. I mean, he could be very tough, obviously, and very, but he's not a corporate real estate type at all. And he has always, like, who doesn't want to make money? But I mean, he's not, Mother Teresa. But at the same time, his passion for buildings and passion for neighborhoods seems to really be at least as strong as his desire to make money. And,
in many ways, stronger. I think.
Yeah.
I think the urbanist in him, the drive to be authentic, no matter where he was working, that the most important thing was that the essence of a building or a community was what you saw, that it was real. That's why, for example, in many ways, in the early days of Dumbo, it was so successful in terms of people on the street and the sidewalks, because he knew that it was important to have retail, cultural facilities, mixed use, and money was the opposite of achieving those goals. You couldn't make money in retail. You couldn't charge large rents for artists. But he knew that was the essence of what a city is and a neighborhood is. So he was willing to give up the opportunity to make money, to make it authentic, and to make it truly a mixed-use community.
Which is why Dumbo has not gone the way of Soho. I mean,
Right.
Even though it suffers, as we said a moment ago, in some ways from too much, not too much success, but suffers from great success. Nevertheless, it was never the place where you were going to see, Louis Vuitton and Prada and all those, and Gucci and so forth and so on. It's an awful lot. The retail in Dumbo is mostly either real stuff that people use and like the bakery and the Forger's grocery and places like that, or the place where you can get tea and cookies and what have you, or cultural facilities and art galleries, many of which got their space at below market rates, because just as you've said, David understood how important that was to the neighborhood and was willing to invest in that to make other things happen. And I cannot think of anybody else who could have kind of managed growth the way David did in Dumbo. I mean, the more I look at it, the more I think about it, the more remarkable it is. And there's another side of it too that I think is equally remarkable, which is that even though they controlled the neighborhood tightly and brought in all these cultural organizations and artists at below market rents to populate the neighborhood in effect with culture, They didn't micromanage design completely. I remember Jed Walentis telling me, it's for me one of the most telling moments really in the whole story, when they got the first Korean grocer to come in to Dumbo. They wanted to do a sort of standard, somewhat ugly sign, and it didn't really fit with the kind of more sophisticated air that they were gradually building at Dumbo. But they made a deliberate decision to leave it, not so much to avoid a fight with the Korean deli, as because they thought it would be more authentic that way. And they did not want every last inch to be perfect, because then it's Disneyland, then it's not real. And that sense of what makes authenticity in a neighborhood that David does seem to innately feel is really important. Same reason that however much he enjoys the fruits of prosperity and is proud of Dumbo and feels correctly that it's largely his creation, he never really wanted to control every square inch of it, and that they've welcomed other developers doing other things, some of which are actually quite good, some others of which are quite bad. I wish that, I wish a couple of those buildings weren't there, but there also are a couple that are at least as good as anything David has ever done. And in any case, they contribute to a sense of, I guess you could say, sort of heterogeneity architecturally in the neighborhood. It's not all perfect. It's not all one single, very narrow vision.
Well, part of that wasn't necessarily all intention on David's part. I mean, for example, he spent almost all of those 40 years trying to get involved and take over the Empire stores. And
yes.
And so did I. I mean, both of us saw that was in many ways the sort of the image and the focal point for activity in Dumbo. And with all the effort and all the good work that David had been doing, he didn't want to miss out on that one, kind of like the heartbeat of the community. So, as you know, and probably maybe many people don't know, there were many RFPs and efforts at development competitions, and most of them were retracted. The last one, which naturally David and I went in together on, David lost.
I know.
And it was a huge.
No, I know. I tell the story in the book of the many iterations of the Empire stores, which is sort of the heart of Dumbo and the greatest original landmark in Dumbo.
Right.
And he was not able to do it himself.
Right.
Yeah.
But he was very gracious about a conversation I had with him, and I think you mentioned it in the book, that he thought it was well done by those who did it. I commend the architects. They did an excellent job. They were very creative. There's a lot of modern qualities to the interior. The exterior is impeccably restored. It rides very well between the open space and those majestic buildings that David has. And it is a success, and David said it was a success and knows that it's a good thing. And he is not jealous or in any way annoyed by not being that developer. He feels he's done enough.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. Look, I think at the time that he was not designated as developer, he was not quite as generous probably in his feelings, but and he'd been through so much angst and so much agony and so many things that seemed almost within his grasp and then were taken away. There's obviously has to have been huge frustration in not getting designated as the developer for the Empire stores, which, for those who don't know, is a great landmark that is owned by the state of New York. So it was a public process about designating the developer that went through multiple iterations. David sort of failed several times. It didn't quite work out for different reasons, but the final iteration went to another developer. But I've heard David say exactly as you had, he has to admit they did a good job. I think it came out wonderfully. And now, and since David certainly has no shortage of square footage in Dumbo himself, while it would have been interesting to see what he and you would have done with it, at this point, it's still a success, and there's a kind of diversity of voices and diversity of ownership as well, which is not a bad thing for Dumbo, I suppose.
That was wonderful. Of course, the other phenomenal thing, and maybe in many ways, we'll all remember more fondly than almost anything else, is the Carousel.
Yes, yes, yes.
And Jane's Carousel was purchased, as you know, not long after David purchased the Gare buildings.
Right.
The early 80s. But they purchased it, here it was in Youngstown, Ohio. How did they found it? I don't know. But a national designated landmark carousel.
Yeah, I wonder if there are carousel brokers around that help you find a carousel. I don't know.
David, I don't know, he has a way, he has a nose. Yeah. But when they came back, when they told me that they just bought a carousel, I said, wow, that's a great idea. What are you going to do with it? Well, we're going to restore it. But then where are you going to put it? Oh, of course, it's going to be right there in Brooklyn Bridge Park, which was called Empire State Park.
It wasn't even called Brooklyn Bridge Park then.
Right. And of course that's where we're going to put it. And of course it only took 40 years, but that's where he did put it. And, right. This is classic David. Absolutely remarkable risk-taking, remarkable self-confidence, patience that one can't believe, because if it took 40 years to do something like that, you couldn't be worrying about it all the time. He just knew that he did it right. He knew that he was doing everything right, but sometimes it was a war. But I think Jane's Carousel, with the Jean Nouvel, incredibly glossy, almost non-existent building.
Right.
In the heart of the park, overlooking the river, with its carousel going dead at night, with lights, is truly one of New York's landmarks.
Yes, no, absolutely. Right.
Because of its position and its sort of uniqueness as a you can see it from all over. You can see it from an airplane. It's truly a tribute to Jane, and Jane was a very artistic person, as you know. She spent all those years restoring and painting the horses and the carriages and the medallions. Then, of course, we've lost Jane, and it's even more so important to honor that phenomenal accomplishment.
I agree completely. While I do not want to take away attention from this book today, since that's our focus, there's actually a book specifically on the carousel that Jane was working on at the time of her death, and that David saw through to completion, that I think Phaidon is publishing and will be out later this year, I believe. So they're actually going to be two books on Dumbo. I mean, I devoted a lot of attention to the carousel and tell the story in this book, because my book is supposed to be the full comprehensive story, but the book Jane was working on is focused only on the carousel and has more detail about that amazing saga of finding the carousel in Ohio, restoring it over many, many years, and then, as you say, the struggle over getting it placed where they always imagined they wanted it, but did not until the very end of the process, actually get permission to put it there in
Right.
Brooklyn Bridge on the waterfront where they'd always envisioned it, but they don't own the waterfront. And there are also, were a few people who resented any private intervention into the park, even one that had as much public benefit as the Carousel did, and may have conveniently forgotten that the beloved Carousel in Central Park was also a donation from somebody and the result of private philanthropy, and not something that the city physically built itself. And I'm also fascinated. Another aspect of the Carousel story, of course, relates to, you mentioned Jean Nouvel. I think, David's two favorite architects, I think, over the years have been you and Jean Nouvel. It's an interesting pairing. You for the old and him for the new. And he wanted you to restore every building in New York if he could possibly have had his way. And he wanted Jean Nouvel to build every new building in New York if he could have had his way. And one of the few failures in David's long Dumbo saga that we talk about in the book is the hotel that he commissioned from Nouvel to go at the foot of Main Street in Dumbo. And this was before that was officially part of Brooklyn Bridge Park. And he had the idea of actually building this hotel out into the water on a pier, which had an interesting effect. That was when Herbert Mouchamp was architecture critic of the New York Times, and he loved Nouvel and he loved the project. Most other people didn't, and resented the way it blocked the view of the Manhattan Bridge from a lot of places. And I think, and David actually at one point, when I was researching the book, said, it's just as well it didn't happen. It would have driven me bankrupt to build that building. So, I think what it did was when he announced the plan, it made it clear how ambitious he was, how his goals for Dumbo involved more than just fixing up a few old industrial buildings, but that there was a broader vision, and that he believed very much in new architecture and in being a patron of new architecture as well. So it had the very useful result of establishing David's sort of credentials, we could say, in all those areas, without actually ever getting built. So maybe it's just, Nouvel is a great architect, but I must say I'm fonder of his vertical building on 53rd Street next to MoMA than I am of his horizontal building that didn't get built in Dumbo.
They're probably the same dimension.
I think they are about the same size. Exactly. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Just one's on its side, but that's exactly. Right. I think they are pretty close to the same size.
But there's a fun story about Jean Nouvel. When David said he wanted to build a new hotel, and he wanted a significant architect, I said, absolutely. Let me suggest some. Mm-hmm. So I gave him.
You gave him his initial list, actually.
At the initial list, we went to Europe. Uh-huh. We were wined and dined, taken everywhere, shown all the buildings. Richard Rogers even took us to his wife's famous Italian restaurant.
River Cafe, yeah. The River Cafe got Richard Rogers more jobs than anything else.
It certainly is. It's equally well known, maybe more so. And then Jean Nouvel took us to Lausanne to show us this incredible cultural center with the world's biggest cantilevered roof over the water, and we had a delightful time. And David and Jane just fell in love with Jean Nouvel, and remained friends, as you well know. Carousel is the latest piece of work, and we remained friends and worked together on certain things.
Well, that's nice. That's
It's
wonderful.
a nice story. It's also another story about Dumbo. There were a lot of other architects involved with Dumbo.
Yes, yes.
I mean, I know many of them very well. I mean, John Fifield, who worked with us, but then had his own practice, did an awful lot of the work
Hmm.
at Dumbo for David. Jonathan Marble, whose dad was a classmate of mine, done a
Oh.
wonderful piece of work at the Tobacco Warehouse, St. Anne's
Yes,
Warehouse.
yes. No, that's a fabulous job. The St. Anne's warehouse is fantastic. Jonathan Marvel's also done a couple of other very nice buildings recently, not in Dumbo, but I think
Yes,
the one Clinton Tower
yes.
is his at Brooklyn Heights. Yeah.
Yeah, he's quite a rising star and a lovely, lovely guy. You should talk to him someday. His dad and I went to school together, and his dad married Buckminster Fuller's granddaughter, or daughter.
Mm-hmm,
So there's a very long history of art and architecture in Jonathan's brother, I think. I'm not sure. I think he's an architect as well. So
Dumbo connects to everything.
so
One way.
how are we doing? Do we want to delve into a few more stories?
Sure. Let's do a little more before we do some questions. For me, the interesting challenge of writing this book, of course, I normally write about buildings, not people, as an architecture critic and historian, and yet, of course, you can't tell the story of Dumbo without making it, as we've been saying, very much the story of David and Jane, and then later also the story of Jed, their son, who runs the company now. I had a really, fascinating time weaving together the architecture, and the urbanism, which is how I kind of come into it, as with every story at the beginning, but with the personal story of these really interesting people that are not like anyone else, and have been amazingly successful, but their success did not come easy. And because you were with them in the years when things were not necessarily so sure and so certain, and now that it's come to where it is. The other thing for me that's fun to talk about, that has nothing to do with David, but is for me a really other big part of the story, is the whole history of Dumbo before David Willentis, which when I began researching the book, I started looking into, Dumbo going all the way back to the 18th century, actually, and very much in the 19th and early 20th centuries too. I mean, there were multiple chapters that are really, really interesting history. And I mean, the fact that, most of Dumbo was one parcel of land owned by a guy
Robert Gare.
Robert Gare came later. I'm talking about way back in the 18th century, before Robert Gare. It was owned by a Tory, a British sympathizer during the Revolutionary War, who fled back to England and abandoned the land. And when we won the revolution, it was taken over by the then new state of New York, which sold it to the Sands family, Long Island real estate investors, who had created Sands Point out in Long Island. And they initially tried to create a small village on the waterfront that they called Olympia.
Oh, yes.
And Olympia is sort of like the first chapter of Dumbo's existence. And when I learned about Olympia, it actually answered what had always been one of the mysteries of Dumbo for me, which was, why is there a street called Main Street that is only like 2 or 3 blocks long, right down by the waterfront? why isn't Fulton Street or Atlantic Avenue or Flatbush Avenue Main Street? Why is this little tiny thing? And it's because it was the main street of Olympia, and the initial streets were Olympia, but Olympia never got very far because the industrialization of American urban waterfronts began and went with such magnitude in the 19th century that Olympia only lasted, a couple of decades, and nobody really wanted to live there anymore because it was all becoming industrialized, and the railroad came, and the, piers and shipping and everything else. And so people fled up the hill to Brooklyn Heights or farther into Brooklyn to Fort Greene and Crown Heights and elsewhere. And Olympia was subsumed and effectively disappeared into the gradually industrializing neighborhood. And then Robert Gere came in, who you mentioned before, the cardboard paper king, who invented the foldable corrugated cardboard box, without which Amazon could not exist. And he had a factory in Manhattan, and he outgrew it. And he was looking for land to make a bigger factory. And he was apparently a friend of John Arbuckle, the coffee merchant who had built the Empire Stores and had already begun to put coffee warehouses in Dumbo. And he said, come over and look at this. And Gere ended up not only building his first building there, but then building multiple buildings, some of which were the largest and earliest reinforced concrete industrial buildings in America. So, and then all of that stuff, continued, and Gere built building after building, and it became effectively his, the whole thing began to look like the Gere factory. And then Gareville, exactly, was informally called Gareville for years. And then in the 1920s, after Gere's death, his sons, who ran the business, decided to move it yet again in search of more open space, moved it to upstate New York. And but they held on to the buildings, and they operated them for years as warehouses and just rented space. And then they were sold to Harry Helmsley at some point, I think in the 50s or early 60s. And he had no idea what to do with them. And it was in fact from Helmsley that David bought the buildings. And one of my favorite stories about that is, when David called this guy in the Helmsley office and said he was interested, the guy gave him a price for this building, and David said, but there's 7 of them, what about the others? And this guy couldn't believe that he'd found somebody stupid enough to take these buildings off his hands, not just one of them, but all of them. And he gave David a price of $12 million for millions and millions of square feet of office space, which
2 million,
yeah, 12 million, right, which was staggering. I mean, there are some apartments that now are worth more than David paid for essentially the entire neighborhood. So there was a fascinating history pre-David, as well as, of course, even more fascinating in many ways post-David. But
so just a little bit of a small insert,
sure,
into that history that's very compelling for me, and I'm sure you know about it. As you know, Robert Gere hired Henry Turner to design, who was a structural engineer. Yes. To design his buildings, because Gere learned from someone. Gere was Scott, I think. Yes. And they learned, and the British came up with this idea of reinforced concrete, which means steel rods that are roughened up, inserted into a concrete form to create a more structurally flexible buildings than just pure concrete. And it turned out that it became the most, one of the most important structural systems in the world. The Romans, of course, invented concrete, but it took the Brits in 1840 or something to put it together with steel to make it structural so you can make high rises out of it.
Right.
So
right.
Henry Turner, who had worked with an architect structural engineer in reinforced concrete, was hired by Garrett to design these buildings, and they revolutionized factory construction and the idea of having big windows. All the buildings that you see everywhere else, even and in Dumbo included, brick buildings always have these small windows, often rounded arches, because they're simple to build. But it revolutionized the entire aspect of industrial architecture, and the long spans were created through the technique, and it was fireproof, and it became relatively inexpensive to build. And that was the precursor to what we call the flat plate construction in all of our residential buildings in New York, whether they're 20 stories or 80 stories, they're all flat plate construction, which is the essence of reinforced concrete.
Yet another indication of how, all history connects to Dumbo one way or another, right? But I found Gare was a fascinating character too.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
He had sons who stayed with the business, but they didn't continue afterwards. And too bad, because the corrugated box is probably one of the most popular things made in this country today.
Well, I think they eventually sold out to Continental Can Company, and the whole business, was absorbed by Continental, I think, in the 50s, maybe. And maybe they still have a cardboard box division that's the descendant of the Gare operation. I don't know, but Dumbo was the cardboard box capital of the world for a period, actually. And it's just such a, and you're right. And Gare was fascinated by technology. I remember reading that his was what his old factory in Manhattan was one of the very first businesses in New York to have telephones everywhere. I mean, he was a hardworking Scottish immigrant who sounds almost like a character out of a Horatio Alger novel, and believed in discipline and hard work and technology, and he made a fortune through it all. So the early history of Dumbo is amazing, but then it went into this kind of period of lethargy in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when there was some manufacturing, but it was gradually leaving the city, and nobody quite knew what to do with those buildings or what kind of future there was. When Helmsley owned them, they were some old manufacturing tenants, but a lot of the space was used for warehouses, and they saw no future in any of them. That was the amazing thing. David comes, and it's the late 70s. New York is still in not great shape in the late 70s. But there were also these little signs that things were turning around, particularly, I mean, even in this part of Brooklyn, because when David arrived, it was not that long after the River Cafe had opened, and it was still relatively new. And I remember writing myself about the River Cafe when it was new, and saying it was there was just a gradual little signs of Renaissance around the waterfront in Brooklyn, but there's almost nothing except the symbolic beginning, the kind of, flower that is pushing its way up through the concrete is the River Cafe. And that's where David went and had lunch the day that he then started walking around to discover Dumbo. And the rest is history, I guess. The rest is this history, I guess, at that point. But all of it's history. I mean, the early parts too are just so fascinating. And then so we see really the whole, the arc of American cities in Dumbo. I mean, even though it's a small area of just a few blocks, you can see so many of the forces acting upon cities there, from early settlement to industrialization to the industrialized waterfront becoming eventually a waterfront for recreation, industrial buildings of different generations becoming eventually residential buildings. I mean, all of the things that we see in the arc of cities writ large are there writ small, but with an incredibly exciting intensity in Dumbo. I guess that's the other thing. It's the intensity of it, the intensity of the physical beauty of the river, the views, and the overwhelming presence of these two huge pieces of infrastructure, the two bridges, and how they loom over you, and yet they're sort of comforting and nurturing presences at the same time, even with all the noise. They're still comforting and nurturing presences. And then the interesting characters, David first and foremost among them. So, but there are also a lot of other characters too. One of the other things I did in the book was give some of the early Dumbo people an opportunity to speak, and did little extracts, little interviews that were little boxes of just their talking about their experience in the early years of Dumbo, and that was fun to do, and gave it, I think, a different sort of perspective too.
But he made that opportunity happen, knowing that they were often unique, like Torres.
Yes, Jacques Torres,
Jacques Torres,
yeah,
the chocolate maker, who was so incredibly well known and special in Europe, and coming here and opening, of all places, a chocolate store on Water Street, and then he's moved to different locations. So he David knew these people were special, just like him. It wasn't just an ordinary storekeeper. And the same with Almondine, with his bakery. David had a sense of having sort of interesting and special people,
yes,
in his buildings. That's why the artists were always kept there. They're still there.
Yes. No, because he knew it would make it would make the neighborhood he and Jane wanted. Yeah. And I think I mean, they knew that it made a better and more authentic place, as we've said. But you were present also at the time when Dumbo evolved from being more commercial to being more residential, which of course was ultimately where the true great success of it has come in its conversion.
But David knew when he bought the property that he couldn't build residential, but he knew that the future had to be residential. It couldn't just be all commercial. So he had the confidence and the daring to buy it all and build Evans at Clock Tower. That was an office building.
Yep.
And it worked very well. And you know the story, you wrote it very well, of how complicated it was to get tenants into that building. But he swung it, he did it. And then 14 years later, he tore it all apart. The zoning was permitted for residential, and he started all over again. And I must say, though, that the buildings for commercial were far easier to lay out than.
I was just going to ask you that. How was it trying to put apartments into the clock tower building?
Well, first of all, the building, is a giant footprint. It's 110 feet or 15 feet deep,
Mhm.
200 feet long, and with massive, round, beautiful columns, some with mushroom capitals. But residential buildings normally were 65 feet deep,
Yeah,
or
of course, right.
70 maybe at the most, and this was 110. So what we did was we made home offices in every single apartment almost, which was a room that was at the entry. If you can visualize an apartment where you have a corridor and you open the door and there's a foyer, the first room that we created was an office, which was pretty visionary considering now.
I got to
today's
say,
world.
you were ready for the pandemic long before.
Right.
You were ready
We
for
were-
remote work
we
before
were planning
anybody was
ahead.
doing it.
And it was laid out in such a way that it made it a very useful space, and people use it for bedrooms, obviously, if they wanted to, but it was a very handy thing. And the other great thing was, because the space was there, the volume was there, every apartment had phenomenal kitchen, huge kitchen, tremendous bedrooms with walk-in closets, living rooms that were 18, 20 feet wide. It was a dazzling presentation to the newcomers wanting to live in Dumbo. That was one of the reasons I think it really worked, because it was very special kind of space to live in.
They're
And
really loft.
that wasn't so easy to work out. It took a heck of an effort, but Jed was very involved with it at that time.
I know.
And he introduced a lot of very good ideas, and his buddy that he went to school with, Anish, he helped. And so that really made the future buildings, like the ones at Gare 6 on Washington Street and the others, the precursor of what was the typical, exciting, large, spacious apartments in Dumbo. It has to be one of the most important parts of its success.
Right. The clock tower, those home offices, which were so prescient, as we said, I presume that you could do them because that allowed you to do effectively a room without windows, right? Where
you had to provide mechanical ventilation.
Okay, right.
But that was a code compliant.
Right.
People didn't do it normally, but it was permitted. I think it was probably looking forward to the idea of these industrial buildings being converted.
Yes.
The space was there. But interestingly, it's no longer allowed. They took that aspect of the code and eliminated it. And I don't know why, because we're constantly running into the need to convert industrial buildings, and certainly office buildings. Look at all the office buildings.
Yeah, I mean, now, right. I mean, I think the conversion of various forms of commercial architecture, whether industrial or office, into residential is not stopping at all.
No, it's increasing because the office space is less and less needed.
Right. And
look at the financial district.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. It's I would say it's kind of tipped the balance. It's more residential than it is office.
I know. No, that's right. I mean, it's been a complete metamorphosis.
Right.
And the only buildings I think that are likely to remain offices for a while more are the newer ones,
right,
with more systems and larger floor plates.
Right.
And almost everything that is older or smaller is being converted.
Right.
Yeah.
The corner of Wall Street and Broadway is being converted to residential.
One Wall Street.
Right,
which was like the iconic address of American banking. Right. Well, and then 23 Wall Street too, the old JP Morgan.
That's right.
I mean, basically, it's all residential now. It's true.
Right.
It is a different world entirely. Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know if we have some questions or if this is the last few minutes, if there are any, this is the time to take some. But I'm not sure we do.
So there is an audience.
There is an audience, definitely. Yes, it's showing up here that we have an audience, but I don't think we have, unless if the questions that are come on the chat, they haven't. So.
Well, it's more important to sign up and buy a book than the chat, frankly.
Thank you. Well, that's true. That's true. I hope people will buy. I hope very much people will buy books. Yes, yes, and buy them through Powerhouse Books. So definitely. Great. If there are not, I don't know. I don't know if Chris is still monitoring. If there are. Hi. Do we have any questions or?
Looks like we might not.
Okay.
I think that might have covered everything.
We've answered everything. Exactly. Exactly. We've been.
Yeah.
Or whatever we haven't answered, the book does. We'll put it that way. So,
Right.
Great.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah,
Good.
definitely. Everyone buy the book. We have the link in the chat. We'll have signed copies. Oh wait. Here we go. Here we go. We have a question.
A question is
I'll,
just appeared. Okay.
Yeah, we'll can answer this question before I close it up here. Nick asks, do you think some of the new buildings coming up will change the integrity of Dumbo? That's a good question.
Very good question. Okay.
Some have, but
Yes.
not significantly.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I mean, there are a couple of buildings near the F train that I think are woefully ordinary and
Yeah.
could
Right.
be almost anywhere. I'm happy to say they were not built by David's company, Two Trees. And I wish they were better. They're not the very worst buildings in New York, but they certainly are far from the best. And they don't add much to Dumbo, let's put it that way. They look a little bit like they should have been in downtown Brooklyn and kind of got lost and built there. There's a very large building going up also right at York and Front by Morris Adjemi that tries a little more conscientiously, I think, to respond to the industrial heritage of Dumbo. I think it's just between us. I think it's not turning out quite as well as it looked like it was going to in the renderings. And it's also really, really big, but it's better than the other couple that I was referring to. I think the best new buildings in Dumbo, I think there's a couple of small buildings
Small
done
ones.
by
Yeah.
Jared Delavalle and his partner, AJ Pires, the Alloy Development Company. 1 John Street is one of them, which is really lovely. It's a very elegant concrete building right on the water at the end of Brooklyn Bridge Park. That I
Right.
think is actually one of maybe the best new building in Dumbo at this point. It's lovely and it's strongly modern, but understated at the same time. It works well with the historic fabric. And it's one that I particularly admire. And they've done some other nice stuff around Dumbo as well, actually, I think. Although I think, the large building that David and Jed and the firm have done at 60 Water Street by Thomas Lesser is I think very good building. It may not be the very best new building in Dumbo, but I put it way ahead of the disappointing ones. It's not a disappointing building. It just is not a great building, that's all. But the question about integrity of Dumbo is a really important one because, I strongly believe that a historic neighborhood is not a museum. and it can and should grow and change, but it has to do so in a respectful and careful way. You can't put just anything there. And I do feel now, especially with a big site at the end of Main Street that had been empty for a long time now, with a building going up in it, the Dumbo is getting very close to being built out now. And I mean, it's a small neighborhood anyway, and I think there's not going to be much else now, which is probably fine, actually, since the historic fabric still really, the historic fabric and the waterfront are still the dominant things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as they should be.
Well, one of the great things about Dumbo is its boundaries. The boundaries are so visible, so completely understandable. They frame the community, and they will do it forever. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's safe. And
yeah, that's right. Well, first, I mean, the river is the river. That's not going to change. And actually, though I don't want to say anything that someone's going to take out of context and use against me, but one is almost weirdly, perversely grateful for the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Because I'm not really, I don't want that to be taken literally. It's still horrible, but it does create a defined boundary.
Yeah.
And a wall, it creates for one part of Dumbo a sort of wall, and that you have to kind of go around it to enter the neighborhood. I mean, many of the time I've come on foot from Brooklyn Heights or from the A train, and walking down and around, it's like you have to go and come through the door and go into the neighborhood. Normally, connections are the most important thing, and porosity is important in urban neighborhoods. But in fact, in this particular case, you're right. Maybe it's actually helped in the end.
It's unusual. It's also unusual not to have a highway separating the waterfront from the residential. Very few areas in the city.
How lucky we are that the BQE, horrible though it is, wasn't along the waterfront.
Wasn't along the waterfront.
You're right.
No, it's a very special neighborhood.
One of the many. I mean, there's so much luck in this saga, as well as talent and skill and vision, and that's one piece of luck.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So another piece of luck is that long before David, the preservation community in Brooklyn Heights, which took a certain proprietary interest in Dumbo, although not very much so, but just enough to fight a very misguided plan the city had back in the 60s, in the Lindsay years, to move the wholesale Brooklyn meat market to the waterfront in Dumbo.
Yeah.
It was being relocated, and the city at one point proposed that site. And if it had not been beaten back by the Brooklyn Heights Association, it might have happened. Then Brooklyn Bridge Park could not have happened, and then a whole lot of other things wouldn't have happened too. So,
oh wow, I didn't really know that.
Yeah, it's actually, and it was with the help of Ada Louise Huxtable, my predecessor at the New York Times, who wrote a wonderful column about Brooklyn's forgotten waterfront and how these people had saved it. It was so much off the radar that the city thought nobody would care because there was no constituent. They were very worried about people objecting to the meat market in their midst. And they thought, well, here's a neighborhood nobody's in, so nobody will mind if we throw it there. Yeah. But Brooklyn Heights did mind. And so, I do tell the story in the book. It's a short little digression, easy to miss, but it's sort of and it's actually something that, interestingly, David Valentis did not know about until I told him that whole piece of history. So, because it goes back to the 60s. Anyway, another point that shows what an interesting and complicated history it all is, I think.
And how well written it is, I must say. And I learned an awful lot. I thought I knew Dumbo inside out. I learned a tremendous amount and a lot by your wonderful book.
Thank you so much. Truly.
I'm very,
Jack,
very
thank you.
excited
Thanks for
about it.
doing, thanks for everything you've done for architecture, but thank you for doing this as well.
Well, it's been a delight to be with you tonight.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody. Chris, thank you.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. If anybody missed any of the talk, it'll be on YouTube.
Right.
And definitely don't forget to buy the book about can show you we're right here, right by the bridge.
Right.
And
Very
so
good.
come down to the bookstore as well.
It is. It's a wonderful bookstore. I love browsing in it myself. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.